So welcome everybody. So I'm very happy to be able to introduce the seminar speaker today. One of the things that all of us have in common here at LSTM, no matter what our discipline, is that we probably all work with research institutes in low and middle income countries, and so I think that his talk today will be very relevant for all of us. So Justin Pulford is a Kiwi. He got his PhD in New Zealand at the University of Auckland in behavioral science. And after that, he became a research fellow at the University of Queensland in the School of Population Health in Australia. But he actually wasn't based in Australia. He was on permanent secondment to the Papua New Guinea Institute of Medical Research, which is actually where I first met him. And at the PNG IMR, he was the head of the Population Health and Demography Unit, and he also led the outcome and impact evaluation of PNG's first nationwide long-lasting insecticidal bed net distribution, which was a mammoth task. And after his stint in PNG, Justin moved to Liverpool, where he's currently working on various different projects related to strengthening research capacity in low and middle income countries. And today he'll be talking about the Capacity Research Unit's mission here at LSTM. So, Justin?
Thank you, Eddie. That's working okay? Can hear me all well? Great. And thanks for the very, very kind introduction. I think the last time I was mic'd up like this was for the local auditions for UK's Got Talent. And the judges concluded that I didn't have any. So hopefully I'll do a bit better today. So the presentation's titled Research Capacity Strengthening in Low and Middle Income Countries. And it's asking the question, is it time for dedicated or specialist research capacity strengthening science? A sort of basic overview of what I'm going to cover. The presentation's part informative, so certainly I hope to introduce perhaps more broadly the concept of research capacity strengthening, or I might just say RCS to abbreviate that a little bit. Explore why it's an important endeavour, examine the evidence base in support of RCS implementation, and then present this argument for advancing a specialist RCS science. But the symposium, I guess, to be totally transparent, is also part promotion to introduce the Capacity Research Unit from the school and to outline our approach to advancing RCS science. So part information, part promotion, I guess infomercial, that sort of thing. So research capacity strengthening, what is it? So let's start with a definition. And I'm presenting this one, which comes from the Essence Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation Framework for Research Capacity Strengthening, which is kind of a multi-stakeholder group who support quality and health research and operate through the TDR office at the WHO. So quite a authoritative group and a reasonable definition. Although I'm going to come back to the topic of definitions later, so we'll start here, but we might not finish here. So according to Essence, research capacity strengthening includes any efforts to increase the ability of individuals and institutions to undertake high quality research and to engage with the wider community of stakeholders. And there's a few sort of points to this definition I just want to highlight. The first, that it includes both individuals, institutions, and indeed stakeholders. So recognising that capacity strengthening is not just about an individual person, but about an individual researcher, but the research institutions that researcher belongs to, plus the wider community of stakeholders that support, engage, and use research outputs, which is very important when we think about the task of research capacity strengthening. The next slide sort of highlights this a little bit further. So certainly in current best practice, if you like, effective RCS implementation is seen, should be holistic, targeting the three levels of the individual researcher, the research institution, as well as the broader research environment or research system that individuals and institutions are a part of. So to give you some examples of what research capacity strengthening initiatives or interventions might look like at these three levels. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, just a few I've jotted down. At individual level, probably the most obvious one would be postgraduate scholarships. And this is all within an LMIC context. So it's scholarships to researchers from low and middle income countries. Equally, we would be aware of fellowships and placements for researchers, as well as the development of MOOCs or other forms of online content that are designed to kind of upskill researchers working in perhaps an LMIC context. So all very good RCS initiatives. At the institutional level, you do other things. So perhaps there are infrastructure grants to support the development of laboratories within LMIC research facilities, perhaps support to develop and maintain good quality IRB support within LMIC institutions, or maybe supports around developing curriculum for things such as master's programs and PhD, master's programs in public health or the like. At the systems level, the interventions are different again, so that they may include such things as developing or implementing knowledge translation platforms. So that platforms or mechanisms at a national level that allow local evidence to be identified, assimilated with international evidence to inform local policies and practice in whatever area is of importance. Also facilitating national and international networking of researchers and research institutions that are a part of that national system. And other things such as setting national research priorities in certain topic areas. These don't necessarily happen without support in certain country contexts. So any of these things would be considered a form of research capacity strengthening, but any one thing in isolation is perhaps not going to be so effective. So the idea is to really develop capacity across all three of these levels and through many different interventions or types of activity within each level. So that's a little bit about what research capacity strengthening is. Is it important? I guess it's a fair enough question. And the answer I would say is yes. It took me a while to prepare that slide. So why? Why am I saying yes? You could believe me, but maybe I should provide some evidence. Firstly, or the first line of argument, if you like, is that adequate research capacity is considered essential for development. And this line of thinking really took off from the 1990s and followed quite a seminal report from the Commission on Health Research for Development, or CORED. And they really promoted this idea that essential national health research is a critical tool for equitable health and development, and they therefore recommended that each developing country, taking account of its own circumstances, make careful plans for and carry out sustained long-term programs for building research capacity and conducting essential national health research. So this was kind of a call to arms to at the country level to really invest in developing your local research capacity. But this has also been taken up by major development aid players and development partners who are supporting LMIC countries to achieve just this. And since the 1990s, it's really been taking off. And it's important because research capacity is extremely limited in many low and middle income country contexts. So this slide just presents some examples from sub-Saharan Africa. And it's taken from a report developed for the World Economic Forum in Davos last year. And it presents just some interesting statistics about research capacity in the sub-Saharan region. I won't read them all out. You can take the time to do that. But what they clearly demonstrate is that within the African context, there's varying and quite wide disparity in terms of local capacity. So some African countries have quite well-developed research capacity compared to other African countries, but even the well-developed countries have quite poor capacity compared to even other developing country contexts, and certainly compared to the higher income country context. So even the best case scenarios in sub-Saharan Africa look quite poor when we compare them to research capacity in the UK or elsewhere. So there remains, despite many decades of investment, a great need to continue this investment in capacity strengthening. And it's happening. The global investment in RCS is substantial, and it continues to grow. And on this next slide, I'm just presenting 3 local examples from the UK support for RCS and LMIC. And it's by no means exhaustive at all. But the 3 examples I've picked out, one is from the UK Global Challenges Research Fund, or GCRF as it's commonly known. In 2016, they established a Growing Research Capability Fund, which is just another word for capacity. And in their first call, they funded 37 projects, all of which had as a primary goal developing research capacity at a total cost of £225 million in a single year, in a single call. They've made that same call again last year, and they're likely to keep making that for the next few years. So it's through that one research fund you can see how much money has been ploughed into this. But there are other examples, just the Commonwealth scholarships, which are by no means exclusive to LMICs, but include many of them. Over a 50-year period, over 30,000 scholarships have been given. And you can imagine the total cost of that. Wellcome Trust invested a huge amount in research capacity strengthening, and a lot of that is directed through this sort of 5 flagship programs. The first one being the Malawi Liverpool Wellcome Trust Clinical Research Program, which as a school we have a heavy involvement with. But they have 4 other such programs in different LMIC contexts as well. And they're investing hundreds of millions of pounds each year across these programs. And that's just a small drip in the ocean, really, of the total annual global investment in research capacity strengthening. So a lot of money is being spent. And more closer to home, if you like, capacity strengthening is a central component of the LSTM vision statement, which, if you haven't memorised it, it's right there. So to save lives in resource-poor countries through research, education and capacity strengthening, which admittedly is not only research capacity strengthening, but is certainly inclusive of it. So it's what as a school we try to achieve, and I'm sure if we can demonstrate that, or if I can demonstrate it, it might help my promotion prospects as well. It's something that we're encouraged to do within the school. So very important, clearly. So given billions of dollars, billions of pounds are being invested or have been invested in research capacity strengthening and various interventions across the sort of individual, institutional and environmental level, how strong is the actual evidence base to inform the design and implementation of these activities? So it's a fair question and a good question to ask if you're a scientist, and a very bad answer to give if you are a scientist. It's not very. The evidence base is not very strong at all. Hopefully I'll provide a little bit of evidence for this statement. And what I'm going to draw on is a recent review published by Laura Dean, who works at the school here in collaboration with some of us from the CRU, which is a scoping review of health-related research capacity strengthening in lower middle income countries, what has been published on this topic, I guess, since the turn of the millennium. We were interested in the type of research that's been carried out on this subject in a health context. How big is this literature and what does it look like? So what did we find? Hopefully this graph will show what we found. If we focus on the black line first, which just plots the total number of health research capacity related publications per year over that 16-year period, I think what we can see is that at the turn of the millennium, the start of this new millennium, there's very little being published in this area at all, despite hundreds at least hundreds of millions of pounds investment in this area taking place well before this time. Nothing was being published till about 2010. And then we've seen a huge, well, I could say explosion, it's still not a great number, but a significant increase in the number of annual publications in this area. Now, to break that down a little bit, we look at the coloured lines. So of the total number of publications, the yellow line there is the total number each year that are systematic reviews. And obviously there aren't many because there's not much of a literature to systematically review. The red dotted line are commentaries, so the number of publications that are just commentaries or opinion pieces, and the green line is the publications that present original research. So not a lot has been published. The total number for the 16-year period was 172, and of those, just over half were commentaries. So quite a weak evidence base. Now, this slide is a little bit of a challenge for all of us, me included. Challenge for me is I have to try and explain it. So let's see how I go. What this is presenting is just some characteristics of the 79 papers, or the 79 of the 172 publications in that period, 2000 to 2016, that presented original research. And probably what I want you to focus on most is this. This is the types of research they were presenting. So the largest proportion were presenting some learning, or lessons learned from implementing an activity, or some form of evaluation of following the implementation of an RCS activity. But the bulk of these were learnings or lessons learned. They weren't formal evaluations. The other common category were the outcomes of some form of capacity assessment. So an assessment of an individual's research capacity in a particular area, or of an institutional research capacity. And other areas were quite rare indeed. So mostly lessons learnt and what is current capacity. These columns relate to sort of survey design with a quantitative or qualitative studies or mixed methods. And these ones are the particular types of data collection, so survey, interviews, focus groups, or document reviews. I won't spend too much time on that. But if we look at data analysis, when we look at the data analysis sections in each publication, was it a thematic analysis, descriptive, or did it present some form of inferential statistics? And as we see, primarily thematic or descriptive. So we have a largely qualitative literature that presenting thematic or descriptive works based on lessons learned or initial kind of capacities, which is an important start, but as the sum total of the available research effort is quite limited. Which I guess begs the next question, why is the evidence so poor? After decades of very large investment in an area that's considered strategically important for the development sector, why haven't scientists come to the party and produced a stronger evidence base to inform the direction of this investment? Good question, and the answer in part is because I think it reflects the complexity of the subject. RCS is a very complex subject, and it's not necessarily easy to apply scientific methodology to. So it's inherently multifaceted, it's long-term, it's a continuous process, and it's subject to a diverse range of influences. So you can well imagine if you invest in training a particular individual, you can measure outcomes at an individual level, but that's not necessarily going to contribute much in terms of impact. That person would then need to go back to their local institute. They're going to receive a lot more support than perhaps the training you provided. Their ability to implement that training will depend on institutional structures and the bigger research system. And to really see change over time, you need to understand the influences across all those levels and how they interact, which is just a complex task. And maybe it scares some of us off. But arguably, the more important factor has been the fragmented ad hoc nature of the research effort to date. So certainly there has been some research, and the examples I gave don't represent the sum total of research capacity strengthening evidence, only that pertains to health research. But that's probably one of the pathfinders in this area, I'd have to say. And to demonstrate this point, like why I believe that the evidence today is fragmented and ad hoc, I think a good way to do it is to take the case of RCS definition. And I presented a definition at the start of this talk, which was reasonable, but by no means fantastic. But when we dig a little bit deeper into definitions, it gets quite curious. And again, for this example, I'm going to draw on the scoping review by Laura Dean. Here we have selected characteristics of the 172 reviewed papers. As we already know, a good chunk of them were just commentaries, a very small number were systematic reviews, and we had our 79 original research papers. On the plus side, of these 172 papers, and 100 of them, either the first or the last author, or both, were from an LMIC institution. So LMIC authorship was quite well represented here. In terms of the terminology they used, the majority talked about research capacity building, a smaller number about research capacity development, and a sort of a middling number research capacity strengthening. But typically those terms were used interchangeably, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. Other terms really weren't used, although GCRF have come up with capability now, so we can probably add that. But what I really want us to focus on is this last column. And here we I guess, searched each paper for evidence of a definition of health research capacity, which was the primary focus of every one of these publications. But across the 172, only 33 actually defined what health research capacity strengthening actually was. So not many. But then it gets even more interesting. Of the 33 papers that presented a definition, there were 25 different definitions. And only the definition that was used most often was only used 3 times. So we're starting to see this complex picture around how you actually define what research capacity strengthening is. This is one of my bigger challenges today, is to explain this to you. Now, what I could have done is presented each of the 25 definitions, which might have been nice, but would have taken a lot of time. So what I'm presenting here is the results of a kind of a content analysis of those 25 definitions. So an attempt to assess their quality, if you like. So what we'll focus on first are these first 2 columns here. And this presents the subject defined and the capacity term. So in the first paper, let's say at the top, the definition presented was of health research capacity building. In the second paper, it was also that. Third paper, research capacity building, so on. So not all of them, although they presented definitions, they weren't all presenting them as health research capacity strengthening definitions. Sometimes it was just research capacity, other times it was just capacity. In other cases, they used funny terms like progress. But they were using the definition in the context of health research capacity strengthening. In some cases, the same definition was described slightly differently in different publications. So you get the same definition, and in some cases it would be called health research capacity building, in others health research capacity strengthening, in others just capacity strengthening. So there was some inconsistency about how the same definition was being presented. Now these 10 columns, each one represents kind of a predetermined characteristic that we looked for in each of the definitions. And they're not well explained on this table, but let me try and explain them to you. So the first 3 stand for individual, institutional, and environmental. So did the definition explicitly refer to individual, institutional, or environmental capacity strengthening? And as you can see across the 25, some referred to all 3, some referred to just 2 of the 3, some 1, a few none at all. Then we have these three columns, which are short for does the definition cover kind of the research process in full, from the defining a research problem or and creating study design, to carrying out the research itself, to then applying the research. So all essential features of a full research cycle, if you like. And again, you can see that there weren't many definitions that pertained to the full sort of research cycle. The last four columns were just other features we looked for in the definition. Did it make reference to quality research? So it's one thing to strengthen capacity, but ideally we're focusing on quality research capacity. Is it sustainable capacity? Does it recognise that capacity strengthening is a process, it's not a one-off thing, or indeed is it continuous? So we scored the 25 definitions on these different criteria, trying to identify perhaps the better definitions from the weaker ones. And here's an example of perhaps one of the weaker definitions. It wasn't the only weak one, but the capacity of research departments and universities, think tanks, and so on to fund, manage, and maintain themselves, which only met 2 of our 10 predetermined criteria, and as far as I can tell, is a definition for the capacity to exist. So does this institution have the capacity to remain viable? Which is very important, but surely it's more important to do something other than just exist. I'm sure we're all very happy LSTM exists, but if all we did was come into work and sit down and eat lunch, maybe we'd be a bit dissatisfied with what this institution is achieving in the world. So perhaps quite a weak definition, or a very limited definition, of capacity strengthening. A stronger example, which met 9 out of the 10 content criteria, none of them met all 10, is this, which is strengthening the abilities of individuals, institutions, and countries to perform research functions, define national problems and priorities, solve national problems, utilise the results of research and policy making and program delivery. So I think you can immediately see it's more comprehensive. It's a better definition. It covers all 3 of our sort of research capacity strengthening levels: individuals, institutions, and countries. The full range of the research process, from identifying problems to performing the research functions and then utilising the results. All very good. But again, is it perfect? Not really. And if we wanted to be a little critical of this, we might suggest that it limits the focus to national problems, which is obviously important for any research institute to have the capacity to address national problems. But is that not limiting in a way? As a scientist, as a research institution, should that be your sole focus? Or do you not have, indeed, interests in other areas of academia or in other areas of science? And shouldn't we be looking to develop capacity more broadly than that? And this school is a good example of that. I'm sure at LSTM we spend more time focusing on other nations' problems than the UK's own. So that this definition wouldn't encourage that. So good, but not perfect. And I guess that's the problem with this literature, is that there really isn't a standout definition that has wide acceptance. So in sum, there's no consistent understanding of what research capacity strengthening actually is, which is quite fundamental really, because these terms are used a lot. There are so many funding organisations, so many implementing organisations, so many research organisations that talk about research capacity strengthening. We all use the words, we all think we know what each other is saying, but nobody's actually taken the time to define and agree on what we're actually saying. So we might be completely at odds with each other, and I think we often are. But that's not the only problem. There's no agreed or uniformly applied terminology. So these issues around, is it capacity building, capacity strengthening, capacity development, is it capability, not capacity? Maybe that's not really important, but for some people it is. And that they see a clear distinction between capacity building and capacity strengthening. Maybe building is establishing something from the ground up, whereas strengthening is just working with what's already there. That's been suggested as a distinction, but it's not recognised by everyone. That there are no agreed, or certainly no articulated research capacity strengthening research priorities. So if you are going to invest in research in this area, what are the research priorities? We don't know. And that's quite odd, given that billions of pounds have been spent on this each year. Equally odd is that there's no community of self-identified or recognisable specialist RCS scientists. So there's certainly research activity in this area, but there's not a field, not a recognisable one. So that the scientists that work in this area tend to do it in isolation and not connected to other scientists with similar interests or skills. And as a result, that fundamental research questions remain unanswered. So it's, if you have a certain sum of money to spend and you ask the fair question of what's the best thing to spend this on in a particular context, no one could actually answer. Well, they certainly couldn't provide an evidence-based answer. And that seems strange, given the length of time investment in this area has taken place and the sums of investment, as I keep repeating, I guess. And what makes it even more odd, in my opinion, is that this remains the case despite the fact that scientists are primary participants and always have been in the research capacity strengthening process. So it's often scientists who are providing the expertise in particular subject areas, and it's scientists who are receiving that expertise. So research capacity strengthening initiatives designed to strengthen malaria control capacity or lung health research capacity. You have malaria control experts and lung health experts engaged in that. But they're engaged in the exchange or transfer of subject-specific knowledge. And the subject is not how best to strengthen capacity. It's, this is good stuff about malaria control or good stuff about lung health. So it's quite odd, that, I find. So how can we improve the evidence base? And this is perhaps where the talk gets a bit more promotional, but hopefully also a little informative. And here I'm just going to talk specifically about the Capacity Research Unit and our position, our kind of vision, if you like, for strengthening evidence base in this area. And our belief is that it can best be improved through the application of a robust, multidisciplinary, and very importantly, specialist research capacity strengthening science, which is what's led to the development of our unit in the first place. Speaking of which, I have to introduce Professor Imelda Bates, who leads our institution and developed it from the ground up. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today. But the team we're quite a small group of multidisciplinary academics and research management and support staff. We develop scientific platforms for capacity strengthening, but we're also involved in implementation of capacity strengthening. So we don't just do research. In fact, we probably do more implementation than research. And the reason for that is because there's very limited funding to carry out research in this quite niche area. The funding is to implement capacity strengthening, not study it. So we involve ourselves in implementation, and on the back of those implementation efforts, attempt to carry out some quality research. And it would be one of the very few academic groups globally who specialise in this field. It's quite possible that we invented it, but I don't know. And I'm not even sure it's a thing, so I don't know whether we've invented nothing or something very small. Now here, this is the king of challenges for me today, is explaining this slide. And what this is the theory of change for our capacity research unit. So the theory behind what we hope to achieve. Now, I'll draw your attention first to this very bottom line, which is in fact the title. So it's improving health, well-being and economic development in low and middle income countries through advancement of research capacity strengthening science. And I think that just reflects the argument I've made to date in this presentation, is that if we can carry out good quality science or provide good quality evidence to inform good quality research capacity strengthening, there'll be benefits in terms of health, well-being and economic development in the target countries. Now, if I take your attention to these top 3 rows in green, the impact, and that essentially captures that title in these impact statements. So through advancing science in this area, that will lead to evidence-informed interventions, which will accelerate the development of self-sustaining, responsive, high-quality, multi-level research systems in LMICs, so good quality research systems, which in turn lead to enhanced health, well-being and economic development. Why are we doing that? These problems will sound familiar, hopefully, following this talk, is that RCS investment and intervention is currently informed by anecdotal experience and supposition. So huge sums of money are being allocated on the basis of anecdotal experience, of commentaries based on lessons learned from doing this once. And there's minimal funding available to actually study this process. The research effort is fragmented and sparse, and there's the absence of that recognisable RCS-specific research community, and as a result, there's a shortage of high-quality, implementation-focused science. So our unit is centred on 3 pillars that are designed to address these problems. Let's increase research demand by advocating for evidence-informed RCS interventions and funding to invest in RCS science. Let's foster and support a global community of RCS scientists with equitable LMIC participation. So we don't want to be the only unit doing this. We want to be part of the global community, but we just don't have many friends yet. Hopefully we'll get some more. And obviously we want to conduct good quality research. And I won't bother explaining the outcomes because they're the logical extension of achieving this. So that's where we invest our time and energy. And very important to note, this blue pillar at the end, that just recognises that CRU was not solely responsible for this. In fact, we'd be a very, very small drop in the ocean if these things are to be achieved. We can only have success through stakeholder engagement in our activities and through complementary activities by groups unrelated to us. I'm very near the end now, but what I wanted to highlight here is the kind of the research platform that our unit has and how we can utilise that to inform evidence in this area. So what this slide presents, it just briefly describes 6 well-funded research capacity strengthening programs, all of which are in sub-Saharan Africa. The first one focuses on health, the second on lung health, the third on non-health related research capacity strengthening. This is vector control, One Health, agricultural science. So research capacity strengthening in a wide range of areas. All of these programs are based on a research consortium model where you have better capacitated individuals and institutions working alongside less well capacitated individuals and institutions and actually undertaking research. So learning by doing. And you can see the number of countries and institutions, all of which are in sub-Saharan Africa, that engage in these. So our unit is a partner on all of these, sometimes quite a minor partner, sometimes a bit bigger. And we do a lot of implementation activities across these, but because we're involved in all of them, it allows us to ask research questions across all of them. So although there's some overlap between these countries, we work in almost every country in sub-Saharan Africa in this area. And just within these programs, which don't represent the full scope of our activity, we're also present in over 100 different research institutions. So that provides this huge research platform where we can implement useful research questions that will better inform the evidence base. These are some example questions here. Again, I won't go into too much detail, but these are the types of questions that we might ask across that broad platform. And I think that's the presentation complete. So in conclusion, hopefully I've convinced you that RCS and LMICs is essential to development. That's has been a long-standing recognition or acknowledgement, if you like. However, the evidence base to inform we still need to develop the evidence base to optimise that investment, to make the most of it. And scientists, so all of us in this room, current or budding scientists, whether we're RCS specialists or not, can contribute to advancing this evidence base if we take better advantage of the learning opportunities that comes from participating in research capacity strengthening initiatives. Because many of us do, or many of us will, over the course of our scientific careers. But rather than just focusing on our narrow subject area within the context of that program, we can perhaps step back and think more broadly about the process. And our unit's certainly happy to support students and staff in that endeavour. And on that note, I'll stop talking. Thank you all very much for listening.
All right, so thank you, Justin. Now we have some time for questions. If anybody has any questions, if you do have a question, please wait until you have a mic in your hand so that the viewers watching on the live stream can hear you.
Hello, thank you very much. Very interesting talk. You know, as you say, something lots of us have been doing for many years, but probably not conceptualizing it adequately. I was just thinking, what type of research designs are you thinking of to generate more evidence in this area? Is a randomized controlled trial possible? If that's not the case, are you limited in what you can achieve by, the research that you can undertake?
Yeah, very fair question. And certainly the work we do probably reflects our own expertise, and we do tend to stay away from the RCT designs, which when you look at capacity strengthening as a larger sort of concept, would be very difficult to implement anyway. Certainly at a localised level, it would be possible. We tend to focus on more qualitative mixed method designs that allow sort of perhaps broader understanding of what's working well in practice. So a recognition that we can, through implementing programs, get a sense of perhaps good practice, if not best practice, or better practice compared to other practice. I don't know if it answers your question fully, but we do tend to take a more of a qualitative approach to the work we do, which at this stage of the development of the evidence base is probably quite useful.
I was just wondering, in terms of getting the message out there, because sort of what you said in your talk is that there may be people doing this who don't realize they're doing it or don't talk about it in the way that you would. So what kinds of things are you doing to maybe raise awareness within the scientific community that they should be thinking about capacity research in this way?
Okay. Within the scientific community, I guess what we're now trying to do, and this is more of a recent effort rather than historical effort, is develop viable research networks of individuals and institutions that have interest in this area. And because a lot of the work we do is set in sub-Saharan Africa, we're particularly focused on identifying sub-Saharan African partners that we can work alongside and hopefully get to the position where they're taking the lead. 'Cause it can be a little bit awkward when we're always taking the lead on some of these things. But we are trying to develop networks. One example would be the upcoming Health Systems Global Conference, which Liverpool will host later on this year. We have a satellite session on this very topic, where we're just trying to get people with some interest in this area into a room and connecting each other. We've also got various funding applications in different stages designed to achieve very basic things like a common definition. So there's just some real fundamental things that we're hoping to achieve and sort of starting to get the ball rolling on. I would say at the funding level, we're quite well represented in different funding forums where we promote these ideas.
You gave examples of all the Wellcome Trust overseas centres. They've been going for quite some time, so they must have a wealth of data of local researchers who became PIs, output in publications. Is that something going on and looking at the data?
Certainly, in some cases, this information is available. I guess part of the issue is, particularly when we look at the progress of individuals and their individual career development, we can, there are measures exactly as you've identified around publication output, around grant output, but how this fits within a larger institutional or systems arrangement is much harder to decipher. And of course, the issue with the Wellcome Trust funded centres is they're so unrepresentative of typical research institutions in the regions that they're based. So the impact at the institutional level is perhaps quite different to the norm. So there are some issues there as well. But we are, one of our current projects is designed to do just this, is to really flesh out a full range of indicators that could be used to monitor over time, not just progress of individuals, but institutions and the broader system. So again, quite fundamental questions that haven't really been thought through. So we're trying to get indicators in place that would allow programs like these Wellcome Trust funded ones to monitor more fully their impact.
I have a question. I'm not sure there's
anyone. So my question relates to this idea that you mentioned before of RCS being a very complex science. Arguably, the context in which research is implemented, both in terms of the individual and institutional, can vary quite a bit from place to place. And it won't be necessarily unique to Research Institute. Like things that I'm thinking about are like, human resource policies or the financial system that is in place there. So how do you account for the context in which, the context of the situation that you're working in, and extending that, how will you then be able to have some conclusions that are then applicable to other situations?
Okay. Well, I think the first point is that you need to account for the context. So absolutely. And you need to understand the context in which certain interventions or certain RCS interventions or programs are implemented, and at least document the progress of those interventions or initiatives within that context. And even that, I mean, these are very fundamental things that haven't happened to date. So you're quite right. There are, if we take the sub-Saharan African context, there are research institutions that function really quite well, very well indeed, in quite difficult contexts. But equally, there are other institutes that function not so well in better contexts. And trying to understand why that is the case is important, but just hasn't been done. That this may come back in a way to the question around, what kind of indicators would you use to monitor that? And there really hasn't been any in-depth investigation of this as to what things you would actually monitor to be able to make these judgments about, what works well in a particular context, given particular constraints within that context. So we're still at very early stage, and by we, I'm talking about the wider scientific community, not just our units.
If I'm right, you measured research capacity strengthening by number of publications. And I'm just thinking, is there really an association between research ability and the number of publications that are coming out? I mean, I suppose what I'm questioning is this actually a good indicator of research capacity?
If you're referring to the literature review, those were publications that, as a primary subject, focused on health, the process of health research capacity strengthening. So that it wasn't a measurement of research capacity strengthening through publication. So those were two different things. Although in practice, a common measure of individual research capacity is publication output. I think you're quite right there. That's just not something we've suggested in this presentation. But I would say it's an extremely limited measure of research capacity, absolutely.
Could you share with us some of the elements of the process that through the collaborations you've had and the work you've done that you see as best practice?
It's a very good question. Well, one recommendation that we perhaps often make, and increasingly so these days, pertains to the question around investment in individuals, and is it better to invest in individuals, individual research scientists across a small number of individuals across, or put this the right way. So if you have 10 research institutions, and you have enough money to invest in 10 research scientists, are you better to invest in one scientist from each institution? Or are you better to invest in a bigger number of scientists in a smaller number of institutions? So maybe 5 scientists in 2 institutions rather than 1 in all 10. And certainly through the work we've been doing, it strongly suggests or leans towards an investment in cohorts who are closely connected is perhaps leads to better outcome than investing in individuals who are more widely spread and perhaps not so closely connected. So that might be one example of what we would consider a clearly emerging finding from our work.
Great. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you all.